Hello, in this video I will give you some tips on how to use version control within Eclipse, and in particular on how to use Git together with Eclipse. This video is not meant to be a guide on how to use Git by itself. I assume that you already know some basics of Git and how to use it in other contexts. And if not, I always recommend you to learn version control and Git by itself so that you will be able to use it independently of the IDE or of the context that you are using it. So the important thing to remember about Eclipse when using version control is that the workspace and the place where your projects are not necessarily the same folder. So the workspace is a logical space, and you may have your files in another folder. And actually the easiest way to work with Git and Eclipse is to use the command line. So for example, let's say that I want to import some repository in my Eclipse. I can just clone it locally and then import it. So we take as an example one of my public projects on github.com, which is this one. It is not very important what is inside, but it is a generator for my web page that is based on EMF, the Eclipse modeling framework, that I also use to try out things and to leave it as example. So you can just find the cloning URL. Let's take this one. So you copy it by clicking here. It is here GitLab, but it would be the same on GitHub or other places. Then you find the folder where you want to have it, and in this case you can have open on terminal, or otherwise you can find the folder with your terminal, and you just write git clone and then the repository URI. Then you will have your repository here with some projects inside, and your workspace here separately, and then you can just import projects into the workspace. So you can just click here, or file import, and then existing projects into workspace, and then select the folder. Here it was selected already, but you can just find the folder that you with the repository, and then decide which projects you want to import. And then it may take some time, and then you will have your projects here, and here it says already that it's in some repository on the master branch. And now there are some errors, but it is not important. So to work, so now then you could, for example, modify your projects, and then again using the command line to commit, and you are basically done with that. But if you prefer to use graphical interface, there is this possibility. So there is a project, some plugins in Eclipse that are called EGit, and that I have installed already, so that's why this information about branches appear. But if you don't have it, you can find it in the marketplace, so help Eclipse marketplace, and then it may take a bit to download the information from the marketplace. You see here that it's working. And then you can search for EGit, press enter. It will locate. So this one, EGit Git integration for Eclipse, and here it's installed already, so I don't need to do anything. But if you have, for example, the modeling release of Eclipse, then maybe you need to install it. So EGit has some specific views, and in particular it has a perspective that you can activate. I'm not sure if you see it here. You can activate from the perspectives, so you can open perspective and select Git, and you will have some views with some information about the repository. So in this case you have branches, and you see locally there is the master branch, and remotely there are some branches that are on the repository. There are in this case there are no tags, and there is a remote, which is the repository on GitLab. So if you click on the repository or on a branch, then you can see the history of commits and all the information that you expect from a Git interface. You can view some of this information even in other perspectives, so you can have a Windows show view, and then you find some Git tabs, which are basically those that you saw before, but now you can open them here. So for example, the repositories, you can have it here together with your project. Now when you clone or when you work with repositories, you can clone with HTTPS, but it is more reliable to work with SSH. So if you don't know exactly what is the difference, then you can again find this information in some material about Git. I will put some links in the description of the video. And especially if you have an account maybe on GitHub, and you have or even on GitLab, and you have two factors authentication, then it might be a bit difficult to work with HTTPS, but instead I recommend you to set up the public-private key pair, so that you can kind of log in without using username and password, but just with your private key. So the server recognizes your computer basically with the key, and then it can authenticate automatically. The way in which private and public keys are set up depends a lot on the operating system. So on Linux, which I'm currently using, it's quite easy and integrated. So it works quite easily with not much setup, but it is possible to set it up also on Windows and also on Mac. And depending on the configuration, you may want to configure where your private key is. So you have preferences in Eclipse, in which you can configure all the plugins, and you have some Git configuration here. So you find it under version control and under themes, but the private key, public and private key, is set up under the SSH tab. So in SSH configuration, you can find where your private keys are set up, and where your SSH configuration is. In this case, or normally in Linux, is in the home directory under a hidden folder called named SSH. And in key management, you can generate your key, or you can import some keys and other stuff. So if you have troubles, here is where to look for configuring private keys. Normally you want to do that in the level of the user, so to configure it once for all your applications, but if you are not able to do that, then you can configure it here for Eclipse specifically. In particular, this should not be needed, so you should be able to configure your entire user to use the key, but if you have some troubles, this is especially common on Windows, you can look here. In the Git section, you can configure some other properties, in particular the default repository folder, which is here in a folder named Git. So all the new repositories created locally are put there by default. You may want something different. And you have other, sorry, because I was looking for SSH, but actually if you select Git, you have more configuration that you can check out. You can control, take a look at them. So now I imported these projects, but let's say that I remove them, and again you can delete also the projects or just remove them from the workspace. And let's say that I start with an empty let's say that I start with an empty workspace. In this case I have already this Git repository here because it has been kind of imported, so it remembers it. But I can so if you want to work it with the user interface, there are two ways to work. One is to create a repository locally and then push it to a remote repository, and the other one is to just import a remote repository. So if I start from local, then let's say that I'm in the Teams or in the Git perspective, but actually I can do this also from here. I can just right click and select to create a new repository. I cannot find it in the menu, but it should be there. Let's I cannot find the menu, but here this button is to create a new repository. I'm pretty sure that there should be a button also. But yeah, so we can create a new repository here, and we create a local repository. The important thing again to remember is that it will not be created in the workspace. So actually it will be created in this default place. So actually if you try to create it in the workspace, it says that the directory is not empty, so it gives you a warning. So the best thing is to create it in another folder, my repository, and we can simply create it. And now I have my new repository, and in this folder where I was before, I have this my repository, which is currently empty. Let's add something to it. So let's create, for example, an example Java project. Call it example project. Here we need to be careful to create the project in the right place, because if I create it now, it will create it in the workspace but not in the repository. So I will show you, because I'm using default locations, so it will create the project in the workspace, so it will be in this folder but not in the repository, and we don't want that. So now I will remove that, and we can now try again, example project, and now we can say that we want it in a specific location that is in my repository, and then we have example project. So we need to a bit manage where we create projects in this setup. Okay, now it's in the correct place, my repository, and now it says also here that it's in my repository master, so it is recognized that it's in a Git repository. And so if I also go again to the command line, let's say that I go into my repository, git status, it will say that, okay, there is a new example project here that is not tracked. Let's say now that I want to add something, so I can go to the Teams view. It's in the Git staging view that you can see you can add things to the repository, but let's do it actually from the Java view. So we add the staging view, and you can select the repository, and it will say that these things and these elements are not staged, so they are not added to the repository, and they are not considered for version control yet. So we may want to add those. We can just either do it with the menu, add it to index, or just move them here. And then we can just create a commit. Let's say first import in the repository, and then we create a commit. This one will create a local commit, and this one will create a local commit and push it to a remote repository, but we don't have the remote repository set up yet. So we can just do commit, and it has added these files to the repository. So if you see here again status, it will see now that some hidden files are not have not been added. In particular, also the bin folder, but normally, and this is also something about good practice, and the class, it's a binary, basically it's a bytecode. In this case it's Java, so it's a derived file, and you don't want this to be in your repository, so you can ignore it. And this is not particularly easy, I think, to do in the graphical interface, because if you set ignore, then yes, it will create a git ignore file in the binary folder. It is an hidden hidden file, in which it says that, okay, it will ignore that file. So what we have done is to ignore that file, but what we actually want, or what I want, and what it's probably normal to want, is to ignore every binary, every class file in the repository. For example, if we want to ignore every file that ends with class, because that is it's a binary derived file. So if you refresh, I clicked F5 here, it has refreshed, and then you can also add, you see that the binary has disappeared, and then you say that you can also add these things to the staging area, and then you can commit, adding git ignore file and configuration files. We can try to do commit and push and see what happens. Yeah, can't connect to any repository because we don't have any remote repository set up, so we have just committed locally. And if we see git log here, you see that you have 2 commits. So now what we need to do is first we can create our remote repository, and now I'm moving to this other GitLab, that is the GitLab of 4250 course, and I can just create a new project, but it works the same also on GitHub. You can create a blank project, and let's call it my example repo. Let's say that it's public. I don't want to initialize it with a README just because GitLab shows some useful information here when you do that. And then you can execute those commands manually to connect it, so it will show you what to do. So basically what you need to do is to this one, basically to add a remote, which means to add a connection to a remote repository, and then you need to connect it, like saying that the branch in the local repository is connected to is tracked. It tracks the one in the remote repository and push it. So I will now try to do that through the graphical interface in Eclipse. So what we need to do is to add a new remote, which is a remote repository connected to our local repository. So we will set the GitLab repository as remote for our local repository, and then set that the local branch, master branch, will be connected to a branch in the remote repository. So it will track a branch in the remote repository and then push the information. So we need first to create the remote. It needs to have a name. Normally it's origin, the main remote repository, but you can call it in other way with other names. Like for example, we can call it GitLab. We create it, and then we need to set one URI. So URI, you find it in the information of the repository, for example here, and you can just copy it, and then select change, and in this case it will just pick up the information from my clipboard, at least on my PC, but you can otherwise paste it if it's not picked up automatically, and you will get all the data here, and then just click finish. What we also need to do is to, or it's a good thing to do, is to add push URIs. So we need to say explicitly this branch is pushed to this other branch. We can do add, we can do ref mappings, and then say that the local master branch we have just one branch that is called master, is pushed to the remote branch master. So when you type, it will load the names of remote branches, but in this case we have none. We don't have remote branches, so we just write master. So we have a mapping from the local master to the remote master, and you can click dry run to just kind of test it and to see if it works without doing modifications, or just click save and push, and it will be actually pushed to the remote repository. And here it says that it has been pushed. So we can, so if you see this, it means it has worked. If you have some errors here, you may need to check if your login configuration with the GitLab is okay, if your private key is okay, and also if you are outside the university, outside NTNU, you may want to check your VPN, so you may need to use the VPN for logging in. So we just close, and now if we refresh here on GitLab, so we will just see that now our files have been pushed. So we have our git ignore with ignoring all the class files, and then we have these example projects with some module info and not many things, but our repository is there. Okay, so this is a way. It's not maybe the most convenient way, so as you have seen, it takes some configuration to create the repository locally and then push it in another place. What you can do is to import a repository. I will remove this one, and you can import a remote repository through Eclipse, so you can do it, import it manually, as we have seen in the beginning of the video with the clone, but you can also file import, and then you can have Git projects from Git, so you can give the coordinates of the Git repository here, and they will be imported. Also, I don't kind of trust these tools too much, so I think it's better to work with the command line as I show you in the beginning, but if you prefer this method, so you can do it. Now I will take another repository still from this course. Let's say that we want a repository from 2021. We want to clone this one, and it has several projects inside, and so I can just take the URI and then paste it here. So you have here the information of the repository, and then when you click next, you select which branches you want to get and other things, and then most important, you select where. So by default, again, it will be put in this Git folder on your home, that is the folder in the configuration of Eclipse, but maybe we don't want that, so we want to have it close to our workspace. So let's say that we want to have it here as a example inside the same folder in which we are working, and then we say click next. So you can import existing Eclipse projects, and then it will show you a list of projects that the tool has found, and then you can import them or uncheck them, and to avoid importing them. Let's say now that we want to import them, and we have now those imported, and you can work on that and add files and commit and do all the operations that you normally do on a repository. You probably maybe do that better in the Git perspective, where you can see the history. Now this is the history of this my repository that we have seen before. But you can see all the history, for example, this RA example that has longer history, also you see made by different people, etc. one thing that it's important to remember is that again, repository and workspace are different things. So in the workspace you can actually have projects from multiple repository, and this is perfectly normal and also recommended. So you can just import another repository or just import projects. Let's say I want to import some projects from, let's say, existing local repository. I want to import again the projects from my repository. I can just do that and import again this example project that we had before. And you see here we have projects from different repository. I can also import projects manually. File import existing projects into workspace, like the most plain way to import projects. And I can again import this research CV generator that we have seen in the beginning. So now I have projects from here. This you can move easily. Now I have projects from, let's put it here again. Now I have projects from 3 different repositories that are in my workspace, and this is very common to do when we work with Eclipse, especially with the Eclipse modeling framework. And so I can commit them individually and do other things. So these were some of the main ways that you can work with Git in Eclipse, some of the workflows that you can use. I will give you some other tips in a video specific to the Eclipse modeling framework, how to handle, for example, the 2 workspaces that you have when you work with EMF. But you can check this in another video, and I want to keep this video like general for working with Git and Eclipse, and I hope it will help. In the description of the video I will leave some links for you to get more information on how to set up private key authentication on Git, and on how to learn the basic operations that you can do on Git.